Good afternoon. If I could have your attention, please. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Mark Hamrick. I'm a broadcast journalist and online journalist as well for the Associated Press, and I'm the 104th president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through our programming, events such as this, while also working to foster a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, we'd ask you to please visit our website at www.press.org and to donate to programs offered to the public through our Eric Friedheim National Journalism Library. You can find information on the website there as well. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker as well as those of you attending today's event. Our head table includes guests of our speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. And if you hear applause in our audience, we would note that members of the general public are attending, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. Our luncheons are also featured in our member-produced weekly podcast titled From the National Press Club, available on iTunes, and you can follow the action on Twitter using the hashtag #NPC Lunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have questions and answers, and I'll ask as many questions as time permits. Well, now it is time to introduce our head table guests, and I'd ask each of you up here to stand briefly as your name is announced. So we begin then from your right. John Grano is Senior Managing Editor, Senior Politics Editor with the Christian Post. Dana Brown-Ritter is the White House producer for CBN News. Lila Ibrahim is my colleague at the Associated Press. She is a reporter and producer for AP TV. And we're pleased to have Sophie Bachmann, daughter of the Congresswoman, here today. She's a senior in high school and I'm told already getting to her work at the college level. Christiane Amanpour is an anchor with ABC News and host of This Week, and we're also always want to point out that she's a winner of essentially our Lifetime Achievement Award, the Fourth Estate Award here at the National Press Club. It's great to have you back, and a reminder for our club members and others, on October 28th we'll be awarding that same award to Jim Lehrer of the PBS NewsHour. Also joining us today is Dr. Marcus Bachmann, husband of the Congresswoman. Thank you. We'll skip over the podium for a moment. Melissa Charbonneau is our Speakers Committee Chair, and she is with Newshook Media. Skip over the Speaker. Danny Selnick is Vice President for the Public Policy Wire, a division of Business Wire, and he organized today's event. First one for Danny. Good job, Danny. Thank you very much. He didn't start out low when he shot to get the Congresswoman here today. Elisa Bachmann, also daughter of Congresswoman Bachmann. Nice to have you here as well, Elisa. I'm told that she is a college student in Florida. Greta Van Susteren is an anchor with Fox News. I was looking to see if there was another person in the chair next to you, and I see that's unoccupied. Yes. Absolutely. Nice to have you here today, Greta. Katie Steinmetz is a reporter for Time Magazine. And Larry Bivens is a correspondent for Gannett Newspapers and also a former member of our NPC board. Now you can please give them a round of applause. Our guest speaker today is a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Minnesota's 6th Congressional District, and she is a candidate for the Republican nomination for president. Calling herself a constitutional conservative, she calls for a government that lives within its means, while giving the private sector, in her words, the room to grow. She's been a vocal critic of President Obama, saying that he has racked up too much debt while stimulating too little job growth, and she has vowed to make him a one-term president. Just last week, she signed the Cut, Cap, and Balance Pledge, which says the government should not borrow more unless there are big, immediate spending cuts to reduce the deficit with enforceable spending limits. It requires that Congress pass a constitutional amendment to balance the federal budget, adding a line to the pledge that calls for the repeal and the defunding of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010. Well, not unlike other Republican presidential hopefuls, our speaker today does find fault with the president on any number of issues, including energy policy, gasoline prices, jobs, and the economy. And like a number of other conservative members of the House, she's also been critical of Speaker Boehner's plan, which has included raising the debt ceiling. Her admirers applaud her for speaking in behalf of like-minded Americans. While some conservatives are conflicted about the viability of her candidacy, the old question, how do you position a campaign to appeal to the center once and if you're able to win your party's nomination? But despite these concerns, she appears to be faring well in the polls as we speak and is running strong in Iowa, the state in which she was born, this ahead of next month's Iowa straw poll. Having come from a family of Democrats, she's been quoted as saying that she decided to become a Republican during her senior year of college at a public university in Minnesota. She received her law degree from Oral Roberts University in Tulsa with additional tax law studies at William & Mary. Not unfamiliar with employment by the federal government, from 1998 to 1993, she worked as an attorney for the IRS. She left her position there to devote her full energies to her family when her fourth child was born. Her interest in state politics grew out of an objection to Minnesota's state-mandated educational standards. She was encouraged to enter politics and lost a school board race in 1999. A year later, she successfully ran against a 28-year Republican state senator and went on to win that general election. In 2006, she ran for Congress and won, becoming Minnesota's first Republican woman elected to the U.S. House. Her position as an activist was institutionalized by her creation of the House Tea Party Caucus in 2010, a group dedicated to, quoting here, fiscal responsibility, adherence to the Constitution, and limited government. A member of the Financial Services Committee, she sought to repeal the financial regulatory overhaul enacted in 2010 with the first piece of legislation she introduced in the 112th Congress. She also has added the Select Committee on Intelligence to her portfolio in the new Congress. So here today to tell us more about her campaign and her unique perspective on what's happening in Congress right now, if anything, please give a warm National Press Club welcome to Congresswoman Michele Bachmann.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and it truly is an honor for me to be able to be here together with some of the members of our family at the National Press Club today. It is an honor, it's a humbling experience, and I have no doubt that if I am not humbled now, I will be at the conclusion of the question and answer. So I thank you all for allowing me to be here today. It also was just recently brought to my attention that Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey was just recently taken to the hospital for breathing problems, and so I know we all want to keep the governor and his family and the state of New Jersey in our prayers and our thoughts in the moments ahead. We want to get him back to robust health and to serving the great people of New Jersey. Well, as it was recently stated, there is something going on in Washington, D.C., and the American people have been paying attention. It's the national debate that's before all of us on whether or not this nation will once again raise the debt limit, and more importantly, how we will deal with the economic difficulties that are impacting literally millions of our federal Americans across the nation. In January of this year, Secretary Tim Geithner sent a letter to members of Congress informing us that the debt limit would be reached sometime between March 31st and May 16th of this year. We have now known for 7 months that we were approaching the debt limit, and yet the administration has failed to put forward a plan to either reduce spending or to turn our economy around. And instead, President Obama has asked for a $2.4 trillion blank check to get himself through the election in 2012. In the wake of TARP, which let no one forget, the President approved of and embraced during the presidential debates in 2008, and as well as the President's approval of the bailouts of banks and also an unlimited credit card for Freddie and Fannie, an unprecedented government stimulus bill, the federal deficit and the federal debt both are in shambles. At least that's the way the American people see it. And still the President has no plan. It's unthinkable, but he still has no plan. The American people want someone who will stand up for them. They want someone who will say stop. They're looking for someone who will say no. I will be that person who will say no more. A little over 3 decades ago, there was a visionary politician who faced the economic challenges of his time. He observed that this was created by the wasteful spending, again, that occurred here in Washington, D.C., and irresponsible economic policies. It was, like today, a time when many Americans doubted the goodness and the economic greatness of our country. Many argued for a continuation of the same policies, and they are these: grow government. Does it sound familiar? Spend our way to prosperity. Does it sound familiar? But this man held firm. He didn't care what the editorial boards wrote about him all across the nation. He did what he thought was right. He criticized the liberals' policies of higher taxes and even higher levels of spending. And he called for resolve, and he called for firmness in dealing with turning our nation around economically. And he refused to condemn millions of Americans to a worse life than what their parents came to know and provided for them. Fortunately, this great man, Governor Reagan, became President Reagan. And how different this world would have been and how different America would have been if he had failed to win the election in 1980 and again in 1984. Does anyone possibly believe that a liberal president would have turned the economy around in 1980 and reduced runaway inflation, or brought down the unheard of interest rates that forced people to almost always buy a home by contract for deed rather than pay the exorbitant interest rates of that time, or unemployment? In fact, we were introduced to a new term. It was called the misery index. While many liberals tried to derail his plans to reduce taxes as well as the size of government, Ronald Reagan was steadfast, and Ronald Reagan was right. Thanks to his leadership, the economy did turn around in the 1980s, and we did enjoy economic growth and prosperity that has been unparalleled in American history. And I remember that time vividly. I was in college at that time, and I had voted for Jimmy Carter. That may shock some of you here, but I was in college too, and I voted for Jimmy Carter. But when I saw the direction that President Carter took our country and how his big spending liberal majority grew government and weakened our standing in the world, and how they decreased our liberties, well, I became a Republican, and I haven't looked back since. As a wife, as a mother, as a federal tax litigation attorney who worked her way through school, as a former state senator who led a movement to achieve the repeal of a harmful piece of education policy in my home state of Minnesota, and now as a member of the United States Congress, the most wonderful deliberative body in the world, who has worked tirelessly fighting against the expansion of very unpopular government programs like Obamacare and unprecedented levels of skyrocketing spending, I've come to agree with Ronald Reagan that government doesn't solve problems, it subsidizes problems, and that government's first duty is to protect the people, not to run their lives. Today, the challenges, I think, are at least as severe as they were when Ronald Reagan stood tall in this nation. And today, the differences between Republicans and President Obama, whether it's on economics, are every bit as stark as they were some 30 years ago. As we debate raising the debt ceiling, the players seem to have lost all sense of proportion and all sense of magnitude of the problems that beset us. In the brief time that President Obama has held public office, we've witnessed the erosion of welfare reform. We've witnessed the unprecedented expansion of government budgets like we have never seen before in our history. We've seen salaries for government employees skyrocket, and we've seen payrolls skyrocket as well. The addition of Obamacare and the backdoor implementation of green regulations through that agency across the street known as the EPA. We witnessed an unlimited credit card bailout. As a matter of fact, it was a Christmas Eve gift that the Treasury Secretary gave to Fannie and to Freddie, and that was the epicenter of the economic meltdown. Sadly, we haven't reformed the bankrupt tax and spend policies that were decried by Ronald Reagan some decades ago, but we have, it is now evident, merely replaced them with a new and a more insidious scheme, and it's called borrow and spend. But be forewarned, be forewarned. If we allow President Obama to pass the proposed increase in the national debt, we will have, and catch your breath, almost doubled our national debt from the 2006 level when I was elected to Congress and when I held up my right arm and swore to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. That level of national debt in 2006 was $8.67 trillion. Today, if the bill is passed, we will see our debt come to nearly $17 trillion. Those numbers are beyond staggering, considering it took us 219 years to get to the first $8.67 trillion in debt, and only 5 years to almost double that amount. I voted against increasing the debt limit every time while I've been a member of Congress. And the Congressional Budget Office projects that the debt will soon be $25 trillion in something less than 10 years from now. Now the stakes are even more serious for our country, but particularly for the people that we serve. The day is fast approaching when our entire budget will be consumed by servicing not only the national debt, by Medicare, by Medicaid, and by Social Security. Anyone who doubts the seriousness of our current fiscal situation simply isn't paying attention. As we know all too well from our history, if your ship is on course to hit an iceberg, you have to make a course correction if you hope to possibly survive. That's where we are today. The current negotiations over the debt ceiling illustrate exactly what is wrong in Washington, D.C. today, because President Obama said, unless we raise the debt ceiling, there will be catastrophic results for our economy. But as National Review columnist and author Andrew McCarthy correctly notes, the problem is not the debt ceiling, but rather the problem is our debt. The lack of a clear plan from our President to substantially reduce our debt is what is scaring the markets and scaring the credit raters. You can't fool the markets. That's an axiom of life. That's reality. The markets know when politicians are serious about spending cuts, and the markets know when politicians are not. While no one doubts our economic situation is dire, it's also clear to me that the administration is attempting to get its way by using scare tactics. We saw that even earlier this week in the President's remarks to the nation. But let's go back to that letter dated January 6, 2011, when Secretary Geithner wrote to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and all the members of Congress were CC'd on that letter, that the deadline for default would occur sometime between March 31st and May 16th of this year, 2011. Since then, the deadline for default given to us by Secretary Geithner has moved several times. According to the calendar, it's now July. And now there have been indications that the August 2nd deadline might not be accurate either. It seems that every time we get close to a deadline, the administration finds a reason or a way to move the date. First, the deadline was in the spring. Then it was moved to August 2nd. And now, several news sources have reported that the deadline might not be until August 10th or perhaps even in September. For the sake of the people we serve and for the sake of the U.S. economic reputation around the world, let it be clearly stated, it is a non-negotiable that we will maintain the full faith and credit of the United States of America. I call on President Obama today, in fact, to agree to pay the interest on the debt. That is an amount that we can pay from our current revenues. Then President Obama needs to exercise the leadership that he has failed to exercise thus far and follow the example of Speaker John Boehner, who has actually presented a real plan before the Congress to prioritize our spending. We must also take care of our United States military, the brave men and women who are currently serving us in not only 2 and now 3 theaters of war, but as well here in our country and in other places around the world. That is why recently, several weeks ago, I introduced what is known as the Promises Act, together with my fellow colleagues, Congressman Steve King of Iowa and Louis Gohmert of Texas. That bill guarantees that we not only pay the interest on the debt, but we stop making our military men and women and their salaries and their families the pawns and political tools of this debate. They must not suffer while Washington dithers. The President should support this legislation. He should take the option of default off the table. This must be done. Instead, once again, on Monday evening, in his speech, the President has opted to use scare tactics against not only senior citizens, but also against veterans under the threat of default to attempt to get his way on this issue. There are several congressional plans. I'm sure you are continuing to cover all of them as they emerge from Capitol Hill, dealing with the current crisis. And the problem is, all of them begin with a flawed assumption that we must raise the debt limit. That's the flaw. The President said the debt ceiling is a term that most people outside of Washington have probably never heard of. Well, that's shocking, because I've been traveling around the country, and I can assure the President that the people outside of Washington, D.C. have not only heard of the term, the debt ceiling, before, they understand perfectly what raising the debt limit will mean for them and for the next generation of Americans, their children and their grandchildren. The American people have made it abundantly clear they don't want us to raise the debt limit, whether it's a short-term raise or a long-term raise. It's the President who doesn't seem to understand the magnitude of our national debt. In his speech on Monday night, he actually compared the national debt to a little credit card debt. Well, $14.3 trillion, which is where we sit today in debt, is not a little credit card debt. Adding $2.7 trillion to get the President through the next election for a grand total of $17 trillion in debt is not, and I repeat, a little credit card debt. What is most striking is that the President has failed to exercise his duty to provide leadership and present his own plan. Instead, the President insists Congress give him a blank check for another $2.7 trillion so he can continue the reckless spending that I came to Washington, D.C. to stop. Instead, he has passed the baton of leadership to Congress and pushed for higher taxes, which he now euphemistically calls revenues, and increased spending with non-binding, illusory, never going to happen in a million years spending cuts that are years down the road. His so-called balanced approach isn't a plan either. It's a focus group-tested code language that we all understand. It's for the same approach that liberals have had for years: higher taxes and higher spending. Nothing new here. The President called raising the debt limit the routine thing that's done in Washington, D.C. I'm here to say to all of you today, that's the problem. It's become the routine thing that is done here in Washington, D.C., and the American people have said enough. Where is their champion who will finally put down his or her foot and say no? But that is the problem. We have to stop making raising the debt limit routine. The President's $2.7 trillion debt limit increase is anything but routine. His increase will be the largest debt increase in the history of the nation. And here's the kicker. We can give the President $2.7 trillion in increase. It will only last 1 year. Only one time have we raised the debt limit more than $1 trillion, and that increase was for $1.9 trillion. And guess what? That also occurred under President Barack Obama's watch. The President also invoked Ronald Reagan on Monday night in an attempt to justify his tax increases. Well, in 1982, President Reagan agreed to $1 in tax increases for every $3 he would receive in spending cuts, accepted by a Democrat Congress. He later acknowledged that what he actually received was the inverse. It was $3 of new taxes for every $1 of spending cuts. Not a deal the 40th President of the United States would wish to repeat. I'm not fooled by President Obama's math. And I am here to tell you, people all across the heartland of this country aren't fooled by President Obama's math either. In 1990, the Democrats convinced President Bush to violate his no new taxes pledge in exchange for, again, illusory spending cuts. And once again, the spending cuts were small, and the spending cuts were fleeting. How many times do we have to see this movie in Washington, D.C. before we know how it will end? That's why I refuse to be a party to deceiving the American people yet again. I won't do it. I will vote against any proposal that includes tax increases or raises the debt ceiling. In the Senate, Harry Reid has devised and the President has supported a plan to cut $2.7 trillion. It would also raise the debt limit by $2.7 trillion. This sounds significant, but more than 40% of the cuts are completely counterfeit. $1 trillion of Harry Reid's cuts come from drawing down in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And while we would all like to end these conflicts as soon as we possibly can, and with success, Harry Reid's savings assume the costs of the war are indefinite, when we've already started to draw down in both of these regions. It's almost like saying that we will save trillions of dollars by promising not to invade Canada. It's never going to happen. I can't support any plan that begins with the assumption that we have to raise the debt limit and yet doesn't offer a fundamental restructuring of government spending habits. I won't do it. And while I embrace the principles of cut, cap, and balance, the bill simply did not go far enough to fundamentally restructure the way that this city spends the American people's money. And it allowed for an increase in the debt limit, something I simply won't do. I also believe that we must repeal and defund Obamacare as part of any solution to our current debt crisis. Why? Because Obamacare is the largest spending and entitlement program ever passed in our nation's history, and it's wildly unpopular with people all across the country. Just ask, hop on my bus, you'll see what the American people are saying. The President promised the average American household would save $2,500 per year in health insurance premiums. He also said the federal government would save money as well. Neither promise has come true. That means at a time when we can least afford it, President Obama added to our spending problem by the trillions. And without its repeal, it will be almost impossible to have real economic reform. With $1.5 trillion deficits, 9.2% unemployment, we need pro-growth policies. That's what I'm about. Putting the American people back to work and providing jobs for them in the private sector. Not increasing spending, not increasing debt. Again, the answer from the President is no. He proposes to raise taxes on job creators, and that's a prescription for a no-growth policy. Another of Washington's answers is to create a new commission on spending. What an idea. We've had 17 Rodney Dangerfield commissions on spending over the last 30 years. Why not number 18? We need leaders who are willing to stand by the courage of their convictions. We need leaders who will stand up and say it's time to stop. We need leaders who are willing to say no. Because when leaders are willing to say no, that means they're willing to say yes to the American people. That means they're willing to say yes to growth. That means they're willing to say yes to an economy that will, in fact, rebound, and faster than anyone thought possible. And that means we'll be saying yes to job creation and to the next generation. This is our goal, and this is our plan, and this is something we can do if we say no. We faced a much smaller version of today's fiscal crisis in 1982 and in 1990, and in both cases we were given budget deals that promised real permanent spending cuts. Instead, we received temporary cuts. They quickly gave way, as everyone knew they would, to new spending. And now we're supposed to trust the President, who's given us $3.5 trillion in national debt in 2.5 years. 5 months ago, this President gave us a budget proposal that would have actually increased the deficit. And now we're to trust him to hold the line on new spending? The American people are more than a little doubtful. And so it's time for Washington to come clean and end the illusion of fiscal discipline. So let me be clear. I won't raise taxes. I will reduce spending. And I won't vote to raise the debt ceiling. And I have the titanium spine to see it through. Several times in the last 4 years, Washington came to a decision point. Each time, they chose the easy path, but that's the path to financial ruin, over the more difficult path that leads to prosperity. Every time they made that decision, it wasn't for the better. And now the time is to answer to the American people. Now the time is to make the choice for prosperity. I see that the time is over. Is that correct?
Certainly take a few more minutes.
Can I take a few minutes? All right. I don't want to impede on the question and answer time, so I will finish my speech in that case. When politicians can't make the difficult decisions, which I believe they must, I believe that that action, in fact, disrespects the people of this country. Why? Because it ignores them. It ignores the pleas that I hear all over Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Florida, Texas. When I'm out there, the people say, Michele, stand strong. Michele, don't cave. Michele, fight for us. Tell me you're going to go back and encourage the other members of Congress not to raise the debt ceiling. They are pleading with us to listen to them. The question is, will we? Will the politicians in Washington finally listen to the American people? Because they're willing to exercise the courage that politicians aren't. Raising the debt ceiling, as the President pointed out on Monday, has become the established way of doing things in this town. In his words, routine. But that must change, because we have to restore true hope to the country. If we don't, we'll continue to rack up debt that at some point we'll be unable to repay. Every day the President is ceding away our choices for the future. Every day the President is ceding away true hope and true change. And of even more concern is the effect that this spending has had on job creation. I've seen it all across America, and it's absolutely heartbreaking when you see it. To go to a factory where just a year or so ago there were over 200 employees, and today it is 100 or less. And it's an employee-owned company where the employees have to let their fellow employees go. The more government spends, the more government taxes. The more it taxes, the less money that job creators have to create jobs. And the larger that the public sector grows, the more the private sector shrinks. And our goal should not be to have every American work for the government. Our goal should be to foster private sector growth. I'm bringing the voice of the people that I love and that I learned from when I was growing up in Iowa and Minnesota to the halls of Congress. I brought it there successfully. And now my goal is to take that very same voice to the White House, where that voice hasn't been heard for a very long time. The people are looking for someone who will champion their values, who will champion their goals, who will speak for them when they feel like no one is, who will listen to them and speak their concerns. That's what they want to know. Will we have a president who understands them? Will we have a president who's walked in their shoes? Will we have a president who cares about them, who loves them, and who wants to see the nation turn around and once again re-engage in robust growth, the kind of growth that we saw when Ronald Reagan put in place the pro-growth policies? Let me conclude with this. I recall back when I was growing up in Waterloo, Iowa, we lived on Lafayette Street. My grandmother lived on Lafayette Street, and I was in her kitchen. She was having a conversation with my father. My father was a big Democrat, As our family, they were all Democrats. The only Republican I knew was my grandmother. And they had, you might say, a conversation in the kitchen about the Great Society. I was a small little girl. And during the course of that conversation, I will never forget my grandmother saying to my father, "But David, it won't be you that pays for the Great Society. It will be Davy and Michele, my older brother David and myself." And my grandmother's prophetic admonition was exactly right. And now we are paying for those programs. And now we're looking to the next generation and the one that isn't even born. And that's the moral question of our time. What will we leave to that generation? Will we leave them better off, or will we leave them with a stack of invoices? That's our question. I know what the American people have chosen. People all across the country have told me. They're forward-looking people. They love this country, and even more, they love their children. They've chosen that we go on. That's their choice. They want to go on. They want to know if the politicians will go with them, and if they will, in fact, choose a future and a hope. I'm listening to them, and I'm bringing their voice to you here today, and I am choosing a future and a hope. Thank you for allowing me to be here. It's been a privilege. I wasn't sure where we're at on time.
For what it's worth, some of the predecessors who've been here at the lectern have actually had presidents stand up and sort of give them body language, and I would not be about that. So we appreciate your willingness to be here today and to answer questions. And by looking at the email traffic that we've had and the number of cards sent up here, people are very curious to have a dialogue with you, and we appreciate that. So I don't think we could have envisioned, however many weeks ago it was that we scheduled this event, that we could have been on what appears to be a momentous time such as this. So for the moment, if you could, give us an idea of where you think we stand with Speaker Boehner's plan, if you see that passing, and secondly, predict for us or give us your sense about how you see this actually being resolved, if it is.
Well, once again, I want to state unequivocally, I think for the world as well as the markets as well as for the American people, I have no doubt that we will not lose the full faith and credit of the United States. I have no doubt that there will be a final resolve. I wish that this could have happened previously, as it should have. I've got the letter from Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner right here. This is the letter that he wrote to Harry Reid, where the Treasury Secretary stated unequivocally, we will see a need to raise the debt ceiling by March or by May 16th at the latest. The President was on notice. Certainly the President knew this was coming. Despite that, the President introduced a bill in February that increased our debt an additional $1.5 trillion. Clearly, this was irresponsible on the President's part, and even today, as we are here gathered for this luncheon in this august room, we do not have a plan from the President. Now again, John Boehner has put forward a plan, the Cut, Cap, and Balance plan. I embrace those principles. It did not include the defunding nor the repeal of Obamacare, and it also increased the debt ceiling. I couldn't go down that road, and so I couldn't give John Boehner that vote. You're all well aware that that bill did pass. However, Harry Reid wasn't about to give that bill a hearing in the Senate, and the President already said he would not approve. John Boehner now has a second alternative that you have heard of. I will not be casting my vote for that bill, and we will be casting our votes later this afternoon. I cannot. I am committed to not raising the debt ceiling. My colleagues may give the Speaker that vote today. Despite John Boehner's best efforts and absolute faithful efforts to try to put a plan on the table, the problem goes back again to the President's failure of leadership. He's kicked the can to the Vice President, he's kicked the can to the Congress, and he has failed to lead on this issue of grappling with spending and debt and the economy. Now it's the President's hour. John Boehner has produced not one, but two plans. Will the President produce a plan, or will he agree to John Boehner's? Again, I don't believe for a moment that we will lose the full faith and credit of the United States. But it's time for the President to get engaged. The clock is striking 11:59. It's fairly late for the President to get involved, but he needs to get engaged.
So how do you see it being resolved from this point on? Obviously, you've been quite clear. You say you'd like for the President to be more involved, but how do we get to that point where we don't make that failure?
Well, I think, again, if I had extended an invitation, as improbable as it may seem to the President, to join me on my bus tour across Iowa and South Carolina and New Hampshire, the invitation still is open. And I think the President would see quite clearly there is no stomach for his current attitude. And also, people are rightly afraid. The President, in my opinion, was irresponsible to frighten our senior citizens and also our veterans by saying that they will not receive their checks. I think the more prudent thing to do would be for the President to have gotten engaged last January when the Treasury Secretary and the President full well knew that we were headed toward this abyss. And so the President, quite frankly, they'll need to get together with Speaker Boehner and Harry Reid and decide what they're going to do. They'll have to make that decision. Again, I do believe that a result will come, and I wish that they would take up the Promises Act and make sure that we pay off the interest on the debt, because make no mistake about it, what will happen? Make no mistake. What will in fact happen is that there will be no reform. There will be no reform of spending. If there is anything that we have to have in Washington, it's a reform of spending. If this bill goes through today, that's a cut of approximately $22 billion in spending. We all know the numbers. That's perhaps, one estimate says, 2.5 days of spending. Let's get serious. Let's get serious. We are going to have, if we have European levels of spending, that will require European levels of borrowing, which will mandate European levels of taxation, and will then lead to European levels of stagnation in the economy and high elevated unemployment levels. That's not the America that I want to live in, and that's not the America that most of the people that I speak with want to live in.
Member of our audience asked, should Speaker Boehner be ousted if the debt limit is raised?
I am running for President of the United States. I am not running for Speaker of the House.
Fair enough. Questioner asks, what is an appropriate level of debt for the federal government? None? 50% of GDP? What factors would you consider going into that formula?
Number one, less. Number two, a lot less. We can't handle the current level of debt that we have. We know that. And so we need to cut back. Now, while there may be times when we do need to increase the debt, particularly in emergencies, that is not the situation that we're in right now. This is simply a function of overspending. It's simply a function of choosing failed policies. No one today would defend the $1 trillion stimulus. It was a failure. The President said if we borrow $1 trillion that we don't have and spend it, we wouldn't see unemployment rise above 8%. It's 9.2%. It has failed to come down. The President also promised us, again, on Obamacare, that if we pass Obamacare, that each household would see approximately a $2,500 reduction in their health insurance premiums. Instead, we've seen dramatic spikes in health insurance premiums. We can't believe these policies. They're a failure. That's why we have to attract pro-growth policies. And as nominee of the Republican Party, I will make it my business to work tirelessly to elect an additional 13 senators that also have titanium spines who will come with me to Washington, D.C. to make sure that we get our fiscal house in order.
So you alluded to this in your speech a little bit. If Congress doesn't get a debt or deficit solution in place by the 2nd of August, what do you think actually happens that day? And can you sympathize with Americans who are dependent on the payments that are put at risk by failure to do something by them?
I absolutely do sympathize with Americans. I spend most of my time speaking with Americans all across this country, and I do sympathize with them. We heard yesterday from our Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, when he made a statement that with over 300 million Americans, the government is sending out 80 million checks a month. The government is paying, it seems, for almost everything in this country. That's the problem. We've got to have a complete review of what government is doing and what government shouldn't be doing. That's the key. We have to have a fundamental restructuring of how we spend money. And unfortunately, with the plan that's being offered later this afternoon, we aren't making that fundamental restructuring. But again, I give John Boehner credit. At least the Speaker is putting forward a second plan. The President of the United States has failed to put forth one. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office said they couldn't score the President's speech because the President hasn't put forth a plan. How is that leadership?
You were extremely critical of the process surrounding the health care legislation, saying you didn't get the bill until late before you had a chance to vote on it. Have the American people had an adequate opportunity to weigh in on these debt solutions that are now before Congress?
They have had an opportunity to weigh in, I believe, in that they have also observed what's going on. That's why I had mentioned in my remarks that it was almost incalculable when I heard the President say on Monday evening, I was in Iowa at the time, and I'd heard the President say in his remarks that most Americans outside of Washington haven't heard about the debt limit and the debt ceiling and raising the debt limit. It's everywhere. Everyone knows about it, and they've known about it for a long period of time. Again, it's the President, I think, who's out of touch, who's not getting it. The people have been trying to weigh in. They've been doing everything they can to get the attention of politicians in Washington. Now, to be fair, there are people here, my colleagues, who are listening, who are trying to pay attention, who have been working tirelessly on the floor, pleading with leadership, both in the House and in the Senate. Let's listen to the American people. That's what Cut, Cap, and Balance was about. It was an attempt to reflect what members of Congress have been hearing from the people. Can you please balance your budgets? I will tell you, just this week, I had a woman come up to me, and we were in Dubuque, Iowa, and she said, I don't get these people in Washington. I have to balance my budget. I couldn't make it a month if I didn't balance my budget. Why don't these people figure that out? Or I was in Indianola, Iowa. I spent almost an entire day in a factory. It was over 90 degrees inside the factory. They're a steel prefabrication factory. And in this factory, I stood by the time clock when a man who appeared to be about retirement age, he had worked all day, he had sweat dripping off of his body, dirt was stuck to him, and he punched out in the time clock, he had his lunch bucket in his hand, he came up to me, put out his hand, he said, Michele, I want to ask you one thing. If you're president, will you promise me that you will give the country back to the people? And I said, yes, I will. And he asked me that not once, but 3 times. And he said, the reason why I'm asking you is because I'm not worried about myself. I'm set. It's my grandson I'm worried about. And I said, what's his name? His name is Isaac. And I will tell you, if there's one thing all of you in this room should know, the bottom line of what I hear across the country is this. The American people are scared to death that their children will have a lower standard of living than they had. They fear that they may have lived through the pinnacle of America's greatness and that we may be on decline. And they don't want to go that way. They want progress. They want better. They've seen every generation has done better than the generation before, and they certainly want that for their kids. That's what we have to remember. And when we increase the debt ceiling, and when we increase the tax burden on our families and our businesses and our farmers, we'll never get there. But politicians would do well to listen to the people. Some are in Washington, D.C. I only wish the president would.
Well, that gets into the question of who are the people and who are you listening to and who's funding campaigns. There's a sensitivity in some quarters that says that people have been distanced from their government because of the huge amount of money it now costs to run for office, and obviously that's going to be a challenge for you as you continue to mount your campaign. What kind of outlook do you have regarding campaign finance reform, or do you think these massively expensive campaigns are just fine?
Well, number one, I'm open to donations. and I'll be happy to give you my website when I leave. But we've been very gratified by the level of support that we've been getting. When I ran for Congress the last time, I raised more money than any member of Congress in the history of the Congress in the House of Representatives. And I'm pleased to let you know that the average donation was $45. And the reason for that, I believe, is because people felt and trusted in me and in my voice. They felt that I was bringing their voice to the halls of Congress, where it hadn't been heard for a long time. We're seeing that same response across the country. People believe that I will take their voice into the White House. That's what they want to see. For campaign finance reform, I believe that it is important for the American people to be able to exercise their First Amendment rights and to be able to speak out. They're trying to speak. Again, it goes back to my prior answer. It's whether or not the people who represent them are listening. And again, I want to be fair. There are excellent members of Congress here who are listening to their constituents. Again, I only wish the President would as well.
So we have a potpourri of questions now on the final, roughly 5 or 7 minutes we have to go. A question that's been in the news, and I think so far your husband has been the one to address it. This comes from a local reporter for the Washington Blade, who says, recent reporting has revealed the clinic you co-own with your husband engages in a kind of therapy that is meant to help people get over their homosexuality. Do you believe that reparative therapy can change gay people into being straight, and has any federal funding gone for your clinic?
Well, I'm extremely proud of my husband. I have tremendous respect and admiration for him, and we'll celebrate our 33rd wedding anniversary this coming September. But I am running for the presidency of the United States. My husband is not running for the presidency. Neither are my children, neither is our business, neither is our foster children. And I am more than happy to stand for questions on running for presidency of the United States.
So just to be clear then, you don't believe that your personal finances are something that should be questioned by the American people?
I am running for the presidency of the United States, and I have no doubt that every jot and tittle of my life will be fully looked at and inspected prior to November of 2012.
Well, speaking of which, the Washington Post yesterday reported that you've called for dismantling...
These are the fun questions now that we're getting into.
Don't forget there's a prize at the end. The Washington Post notes that you've repeatedly called for dismantling Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which back home mortgages. The Post reported that your family signed for such a loan, and so the question, and I got a lot of questions about people asking, is it fair for you to call for dismantling of federal programs that you yourself ultimately have been a beneficiary of? So in terms of guaranteeing home mortgages, do you think the federal government has a role in that, even if you don't like the way Fannie and Freddie have been doing business?
Clearly, I think this is the problem. Now, unlike all of you, who I'm sure pay cash for your homes, there are people out there like myself who actually have to go to a bank and get a mortgage, and this is the problem. It's almost impossible to buy a home in this country today without the federal government being involved. Whether it is with the FHA, whether it's with Fannie, whether it's with Freddie, it's almost impossible to buy a home. One thing we need to remember is that Fannie and Freddie were the epicenter of the financial meltdown. I sat on the Financial Services Committee, and I watched as this occurred. What's important is that we do dismantle a number of these federal programs that everyone agrees are clearly out of control. And don't forget, not only is the federal government virtually taken over this entire industry, take a look at the student loan industry. About 25 years ago or more, maybe even in your time when you were in college, 25 years ago or so, almost all student loans were private. Today, 100% of student loans are government. Now, this is not a good scenario. The federal government continues to insert itself into fulfilling a proprietary function that the private sector should fulfill. This is the problem. This is an intervention by the government, and it's altering the marketplace. We need to get the federal government out of these programs and out of these loans.
You've talked a lot about how your faith is important in your life and for your family. A questioner asks, what aspect of being a politician do you find most difficult to reconcile with your faith?
Oh, goodness. The tax collectors, maybe, something like that. Really, I don't find it difficult to reconcile with my faith. I'm a Christian, and I'm proud of my faith, and I'm extremely grateful to God. As President of the United States, I will pray every day and ask the Lord to give me guidance as President, and even more so, I want you to know that I will be praying for every one of you, too, every day.
So you're in the National Press Club, and we're grateful for that. We had a number of questions about the media. People wonder if you feel like the media has generally been fair to your campaign and you.
Well, when my husband and I made the decision to seek the office of the presidency of the United States, we considered what would be involved, and we knew that this would be a momentous journey and that it would take every bit of our stamina and everything that we had, and we knew that it would be tough. But also, I think that I had a rare advantage, and that's the fact that when I grew up, I had 3 brothers and no sisters. And there is no better preparation for politics that a girl could ever have than that. And one thing that the boys in my family learned very quick is don't pick on your sister. It's not going to work.
You told me that at the end of today's appearance. So in terms of when you're looking to read the news yourself, what kinds of sources do you like to look at? And do you like to look at a variety, let's say from the left and the right?
I do. As a matter of fact, usually I prefer to go to the sources from the left first rather than from the right, but I have a routine that I go through. I have an iPad, and I thank God for iPads. I love them. And also I have a smartphone that I use. And so I'm finding increasingly that more of my news is coming to me digitally, but that's also how I try to communicate with people as well, is digitally. So I receive my news that way, but we also continue to receive newspapers and print magazines at our home. And I'm a big reader. And for me, I have read books on my iPad, on the iBooks, but I just can't get away from actually holding the printed page. I have a love affair with a printed page, and so I prefer to read directly from a real newspaper that I hold in my hands and from a magazine, because I have a habit. When I read, I usually am writing while I'm reading. I'm putting notes in the margin. My husband is nodding. He's seen me do that forever. And so that's my habit. But I'm in the process of transferring over and doing it digitally as well. But I'm a big reader, and I read everything.
So what are your favorite liberal publications, then, if those
Well,
are...
goodness, all right. Well, as far as television goes, I will go to MSNBC to see what MSNBC has to say. Although I don't know if they would consider themselves liberal. They may not, but I go to MSNBC. And also the Huffington Post. I'll go there and take a look at what they have to say, or the Daily Beast. Now, none of these publications may consider themselves liberal, but I go there as well.
Well, Ariana Huffington was here just a week ago. Oh, I'm sure she'd be glad to hear that. Well, we're almost out of time, but we have a couple of housekeeping matters to take care of, and I'd like to remind you about some upcoming luncheon speakers, one of whom is in the political space, much the same as yourself. August 19th, Governor Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico, candidate for the GOP presidential nomination. On August 30th, we'll have an interview with Labor Secretary Hilda Solis in advance of Labor Day. And right before 9/11, Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York. That'll be on September 6th. So before we get to the last question, I'd like to present our guest with the traditional NPC gift, and that is, and by the way, I'll just note, we call it the NPC mug, but you can drink either coffee or tea out of it.
Oh, thank you. Sweet tea. It will be sweet tea. Thank you.
So one final question. Looking back at history, can you think of 2 presidents, perhaps one Republican and one Democrat, that you admire the most?
Yes, Republican would have to be Abraham Lincoln, but I have to tell you, my all-time favorite president is George Washington. And the reason why I admire him so much is because he was the reluctant president. He didn't choose the job, but people around him saw his character and saw the type of life he had lived, and they had urged him to be president. Abraham Lincoln, for obvious reasons. He had to stand tall when the country was virtually disintegrating. As far as a Democrat president goes, I have tremendous admiration and respect for Harry Truman. He was my father's favorite president, and I read David McCullough's wonderful biography of Truman, and he really is a tremendous man when you think that he did not have a college degree, and yet he had to deal with the Korean War, and he had to deal with the dropping of the bomb. He had so many issues that came on his plate all at once, and he stood strong. He stood strong, for instance, for our ally Israel. When 11 minutes after Israel declared her sovereignty, it was Harry Truman that had Israel's back. And that having of Israel's back has made all the difference for stability in the Middle East. I have great admiration for him, as well, obviously, as Abraham Lincoln, but my all-time favorite would be George Washington.
We have a round of applause for our speaker today.
Thank you. Thank you for the honor and the privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming today. I'd also like to thank the National Press Club staff, including our Library and Broadcast Center, for organizing today's event. Thank you, and we're adjourned.